2, 1. Oh, we're live! Finally. So, cheers, everybody. Welcome to the CDI TV, Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick, in collaboration with the Media Lab at the Center for Cultural Media Policy Studies. So, this is our second episode, and the first episode I realized that I started without introducing anything. So I didn't say who we were, I didn't say where we were. So a huge cliffhanger for our audience. So now finally there is this big name reveal. So I am Carolina Bandinelli, and here there's the gorgeous Michael Dieter, and we are the Center for Digital Inquiry the kids of the Center for Digital Inquiry. Michael is the more, you are a bit the geek of the two, aren't you? Like, Michael is the one finding new screen arts and sort of media tricks, whereas I'm more of a cultural study person. And so, yes, this is the CDI team. And then we have Keith Broomfield in the back. So if this is happening, it's because of Keith, and also Rob Butterby. And then we have Cecilia Guidotti. I mean, there's a big team. Maybe one day there will also be you from this side of the screen. And before presenting the guest of today, let's leave a bit of suspense. Let's not reveal who you are yet. Michael told me before, say that we are part of the StreamArt network. So we are part of the StreamArt network. And also Michael told me, say that we are exploring this hybrid space together. So just so you know, we are exploring this hybrid space together, aren't we?
Yes. So shout out to Ukrainia TV, shout out to Confluxus, to The Void in Amsterdam, to our friends in Lithuania. We're part of a network that spans UK across Central and Eastern Europe. We're very proud to be part of that network. The premise is all space is mediated, and all mediation is real space, and we are living in hybrid conditions, and in these streams, we explore it together through hybrid togetherness. So this is the aesthetic premise of our stream initiative at CDI. And this is episode 2. For our series, we've invited people in our network who are producing interesting research, who are publishing books, who are writing theory. We're a bit of the theory wing at the moment of the StreamArt network. And evolving in different directions. But episode 2, we have brought a friend, a colleague now as well, to join us and discuss a new book that he's just published. Introduction, Carolina?
Yes, Craig Gant here. Can we have some fake applause from the... Whoa, yes! Exactly.
You need to fake it, baby.
And, I was thinking next time when we have the guest should come from from a red carpet or a green screen carpet. We should step up eventually. One step at a time. We are exploring this hybrid space together. So, Craig, you're an author, a researcher. In my perception, you're also one of those cool people of Novara Media, publishing, those cool people publishing with Verso. And, I didn't say, I say Verso for a reason, because this is your book, published by Verso, Cyberboss, The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work. So I can see some technology, a clear political stance, a nice retro cover, and also a nice palette kind of match with your style. So in my eyes, you are one of those kind of cutting edge, a bit political, a bit theoretical, kind of a engagé, intellectual, but with a techie geeky twist. Am I right?
I wouldn't say I'm very techie.
You're
That's
not
the only thing.
techie.
I would say, I mean, I'm about as cutting edge as like, a Marxist Luddite can ever be, but she's like coming around again, right? So like it's, I'm increasingly cutting edge, I guess. But I mean, really, I'm interested in power. It just so happens that you can't talk about power without talking about technology right now.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think we'll talk about power and technology and new ways in which technologies are changing the way power is exercised. But before getting there, how are you today?
I'm very well. I'm very happy to be in this hybrid space.
Are you exploring this hybridness?
I'm exploring this hybridness.
How does it feel so far?
Celestial.
Celestial. Yeah,
It
that
feels
was the word I
celestial.
was about to say.
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
a bit celestial.
It feels celestial, numinous, liminal.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of
I
these
feel
things.
very week 10 of the term, which means like I feel like an emptied shell. But this is the nice thing that is happening to me today. So compared to my mood before the stream, I feel rather celestial too. Michael, how are you?
I'm good. I don't feel empty. I feel energized from the term being over. Excited. Yeah. My teaching's done.
See, these are like
I'm ready to do
bourgeois
anything other than
professional
teach right now.
preoccupations. I was just thinking
Yeah,
to myself, I
so-
feel Christmassy. Like,
I do feel a little bit Christmassy in the season as well. We have a
Okay.
Christmas tree
there is a Christmas
just
tree.
off green screen. Craig, tell us about this book.
What do you want to know?
Give us the, do they call it the elevator pitch? What is this book about? We've got the title, Cyberboss, The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work. I feel like I sort of know what this is about, but, give us this sales pitch. Tell us
Wow,
about your book.
Okay, it's a long time since I worked in sales, but I did once, so I'll try.
You can give us a bad sale pitch.
Okay, you're going
It's
to buy it
fine.
regardless.
Yeah, exactly. We've already bought it, so
Okay. I mean, so this is a book that I should say, like the idea for this book like started before people were talking about algorithmic management in the context of work. So really where it came from was a moment in time that I don't think has really gone away, where people were feeling that, like there are some problems with like the idea of the future of work, like things don't look so like optimistic. And in particular sectors, we can see this kind of nexus of like bad conditions, something to do with technology, like poor working hours or contracts, low pay, kind of all like coming together and like contriving this sort of really exploitative way of working. And at that time, people were like doing quite good, valuable work into things like precariousness, but there was quite limited work like happening around like the technology. And like, one of like the jumping off points for the book is that, and it's kind of a wager, I suppose, but it's one that goes back to this old labor theorist, Carter Goodrich, that I cite in the beginning, where he sort of is like, referring to like some trade unionists who are like speaking at a commission around about the 1920s, and he says that, there is like a struggle that goes beyond like pounds, shillings, and pence, and there's like an unrest that like he refers to it as the straining of man to be free. And basically what he's saying is that like you can you can improve wages and you can maybe improve conditions, but there's still going to be something about the way this work is happening that makes us like uncomfortable and that we think like is injurious to interests or like limiting of freedom. And I think that's how I feel. And so I wanted to focus kind of like squarely on the technology itself, which really means like focusing on like how communication, information, power work within these workplaces, and kind of bracketing in a way the kind of precarity, preoccupation, and sort of trying to focus on the actual, like what happens when you digitally mediate a set of social relations that fundamentally are as old as like, industrial capitalism, but what does that look like now, and and how does it produce sort of like political forms? How does this kind of technical reorganization of work like produce political forms that are maybe unexpected?
You said before that you're interested in power and how power is exercised and mediated and digitally mediated today. Do you remember, or can you tell us the story of how did you get interested in power?
I think because I grew up very poor, and I think when you grow up poor in a town that, so I grew up in Barnsley in South Yorkshire, which was sort of the centre of the miners' strike in the 80s. And even though I didn't grow up through the miners' strike, it's very hard to live in that town and be unaware of this kind of like relationship between politics and history and just general social life. And so it's kind of like this sort of like ambient awareness. But I got interested in like power specifically. Actually, it was through initially kind of reading like second wave feminism. This is the real story. Okay, I'm going to level with you. We're on the beanbags. Give you the real story.
Okay. Of course.
Here's the real story. The real story is that, so when I was as young, in my household there's a lot of domestic violence, and me, my mum and my sister, we went to a domestic violence refuge, women and children's refuge. And whilst we were in the refuge, my mum did an access course so that she could go on to like do a degree. She didn't do college or anything like that. And so she got onto this access course, and it was on like women's studies. And so she would kind of bring home these like videos or bring home these like books, and she didn't really have anyone to like talk to about it. So she would talk to me about it. And I think for her, it made her understanding kind of like power through lens of patriarchy, like helped her to understand like what we had kind of collectively gone through. And then me kind of, just beginning to sort of tip into adolescence at that time, it gave me a kind of framework for kind of understanding like gendered power in the world. And then not long afterwards, she got me a book that had 3 essays in it. One was by Marx and Engels, one was by Che Guevara, and one was by Rosa Luxemburg. And so I just like devoured this book.
Perfect present for a
So
teenager
I just
in
devoured
South
this.
Yorkshire. This is
And I was like, well, the Che
Game
Guevara stuff
Boy
like seems
and,
quite like exotic, and then the Marx and Engels stuff at the time seemed a bit fusty. But it's actually the Rosa Luxemburg that I really like latched onto, and this kind of like, I guess, council communism it used to be called, but like this kind of like idea of, reorganizing social relations like politically within a locality. And then it just sort of took off from there. I mean, that's how I really got into it. But then I don't know. My first job was a paper round, and I got like unfairly sacked from it, and it was like a burning injustice that's like motivated me ever since. Like, and I had no representation, like so. I don't know. It was just there, and then it just developed at some point.
I think there's a lot of interesting aspects to the book that we will get into. How you've written it, the methods that you use, the different styles of writing that you adopt, both theory and different narrative styles. But it makes sense what you're saying in terms of your background, because when you describe certain areas of the UK in your field work, I think there's a real attention to detail, attention to those histories that you're talking about, for instance, the miners' strikes. And you do interweave these personal stories as well. Maybe I can invite you to talk about the first warehouse job that you took up, that you mentioned. I found that I could relate to that moment myself. Not that I worked in a warehouse, but as a student, I went through so many different hospitality jobs in all kinds of different contexts, from major global fast food chains to very local cafes, to also a kind of flexi style work where I was sent around to different cafeterias around the city, including places like in Australia we would say, working with the wharfies, the dock workers, and serving them, and just that range of experiences and the people that I would meet, and just going through these different working conditions, has always stuck with me. I say to my students, even those experiences stick with me in terms of like, there's always going to be a week on labor, in my introduction course on media. Anyway, I just invite you as well. Like, what brought you to these topics, though? It was some of those experiences as well, working, and what you sort of saw or encountered in those workplaces?
Yeah, so like, I guess if I go back to a similar time in my life, I remember actually when I was a PhD student, I had, I was probably teaching on the module that you're referring to at the time, and I sort of presented like my seminar group with a list of like all of the ways that I'd like made money by the time I was 18 on like one PowerPoint slide, and it just completely filled the slide of like all of these things. So one of those things was working for a summer in it was effectively a kind of a warehouse that goods would come from high street stores, and they would just be re-tagged with like the sale tickets on and sent back out again. And your job basically was to like open boxes, scan everything, re-tag everything, box it back up and send it off without stealing anything.
So when you started working there, you had already read Marx and Rosa Luxemburg.
Yeah.
Or not? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
because in your book you really thread in the personal and the theoretical. When you started working there as a young person, how old were you?
16.
16, so super young, like a teenager, but a well-read teenager, we must say. Credit to your mother. Did it resonate? Like, were you there, like unboxing, thinking, oh, the Communist Manifesto, or this must be patriarchy. Like, how did it resonate?
That's a super interesting question. I think the thing that surprised me most about it was that it was the first time. So like, I can say it now. I could say it then, but like the company was Next, the high street chain Next, but like, I wasn't working for Next. Like I was working with all of their stuff, but like the warehouse was run by a different company. They'd been contracted by a different company who was only temporarily in this warehouse for like a little while, and they had been contracted by Next to do this thing. And I was actually employed by another sort of third party that was nothing to do with the warehouse like whatsoever. And so it was just kind of like, these entities within entities within entities. And so it definitely like complicated like what I, would have found in Marx as this kind of like, this sort of sense that you have like the working class and the owning class, which like I do think there's a sort of a truth to that, but it definitely sort of complicated the picture. I wasn't yet thinking about like the actual like labor process itself, but like the work was.
You were 16.
Well, no, I know, but like the work was. I mean, it was obvious to see it. Like the work was, we were grouped onto lines of 12. And then as far as you could see within the warehouse, you just have these lines that go all the way down. And at the end of each one, because there wasn't like this was sort of before broadband, like there was a supervisor for every single line who would sort of like stand at the end with the sellotape. That was like their job, to stand with the sellotape for like fixing things, I don't know, and signing things off. And then every like hour or so, like that person's supervisor would kind of come around. So you'd begin to see this sort of like operation, this kind of operation of like capital that isn't, and productivity that isn't really present in the same way like working in a shop, for example, where we have like monthly sales targets, but if you hit them, you're not going to hit them, like whatever, like you might get a bonus or not. Whereas in this particular workplace, it was like really obvious, and it was like my first time working with many workers who like didn't speak much English, for example.
I want to pick up the term that's in the subtitle, algorithmic management. I think because what you're describing is already like these logistical spaces, how much they are now sites of abstraction, forms of automation, new forms of alienation. Your work in investigating these sites, it intersects and overlaps with a lot of other debates, discussions, concepts. I think of things like digital labor, platform labor. But in your work, you decide to focus on this term, algorithmic management. Why algorithmic management? Like, why zoom in on that? Where does that take you in this research? Like, why was it important to really be emphasizing this?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think that there's really valuable work that's done around platform labor or platform capitalism, and also around digital labor. But I think when I was starting out, I focus on logistics in this book, and when I was starting out this sort of research strand, really for the reason that it just kind of offered a clarity about these technologies, and there's a clear political will around them as well. Whereas when you see now algorithmic management adopted in offices and things like that, often a lot of the managers who are bringing them in don't really know what they're kind of getting themselves in for, don't necessarily understand the technologies themselves super well, and it's not I don't know, there's something kind of about logistics that kind of spoke to this sense that they're kind of at the apex of something. But why I focus on algorithmic management rather than, it's fine.
Michael is still listening. Yeah, it just disappeared. Yeah, you ask questions and then you disappear.
I should just speak as if you're still there.
Well, but this is part of exploring the hybrid space together.
It's a hybrid hosting.
It's the hybrid hosting, exactly.
The glitchiness is
It's
part of the experience.
exactly.
Exactly.
Is the present and
Missing
absence.
people.
Yeah.
All
Exactly.
right, but you were saying.
No, yeah. Anyway, so I think when I was sort of starting this out, digital labor, it just seems so I think it's that term almost really speaks to a moment in history that I think we're probably just beyond now. I struggle to think of any labor that couldn't be described as digital in some way, or wouldn't have a strongly
it's too
digital
general a
aspect to
term.
it. Yeah, it's very diffuse, and what I would see around that literature would be more and more kind of typographies of trying to break down different types of digital labor and that kind of stuff, and I'm just not sure how useful that category is now, because fundamentally it's about labor. That's the kind of point of trying to describe it, to say something about the labor. So why not just say something about the labor? I don't mean that to sound facetious, but it just seems kind of
No, that makes sense. But platform labor, I mean, that takes you in maybe a different direction.
Well, so
but yours is interesting. I'll just add to this, I think, because when I read the book, I got the sense, I'm not sure whether you say it so explicitly, you possibly do at some point, but you look at these spaces like Amazon warehouses, and other logistical, highly automated warehousing contexts and shop floors. But there's this sense that the kind of work going on there is coming for all of us in a way. And this is why those sites, with the intensification of those processes, are really important to be paying attention to. And there's also this sense as well, when I read it, that the internet really has become this global logistics system. And also then, therefore, it makes sense to focus on these sites. What is behind the interface of even our web browser is this global logistics chain. I think that comes through really strongly. But yeah, maybe I'm answering your question, but I think still, why algorithmic management within that, within those resonances that your case study has? Where do you go with that concept?
I'm going to backtrack a little bit and say, the reason I didn't sort of settle on platform labor, so to speak, is because I think that, particularly when you're speaking about actually existing workplaces, gets so quickly tied to the gig economy, and it became really clear to me that this is not just a gig economy kind of issue.
Although you look at that as well.
I do look at that as well, yeah, because it's important to sort of do so, but I try to sort of expand that out.
Interrupt you, but it's my week 10 brain probably, but I'm not the only one who's tired in this room or in the world of our global audience. So what kind of work environments are you considering in the book specifically?
Yeah.
Just to put first things first.
Yeah. So I look at like e-commerce warehouses. I look at there's a sort of logistical hub that sort of sits behind a high street supermarket. There's online shopping departments. So these are the people who like fulfill your order. If you like buy groceries online, they go around and like pick it for you. There's a food delivery platform in there. There's Amazon warehouse in there. There's some delivery drivers, different types as well. And so I try to sort of like capture like a part of like the logistical sort of
So it's
supply.
mostly logistics.
Yes.
So was your like criteria of inclusion, so to speak. You wanted to look at the logistics and how would the logistic work, or what is sort of behind the apparently immaterial and smooth surface onto which we click when we buy something.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Like there's a word of workers that we sort of tend to forget. Okay, and then we were saying we are talking about algorithmic management. So it's not really platform labor, it's not digital labor, it's algorithmic management. And so to go back to Michael's question,
Or maybe another one here, just to make it clear. What is management?
yeah,
People mention to me like, oh, this is a decision for management, or
we need
you know,
three microphones.
yeah. people will, they'll say to me, oh, this is coming from management, or this is, but like, what is management? Like, why do we need to pay attention to that? Maybe that's the first step. Like, what for you is management all about?
Well, I think fundamentally what I think management's about is, so labor is a commodity, and it's a commodity unlike other commodities in that when it's purchased in the world, you hire someone, you're hiring their potential for work, not the actual product of their work yet. So in the process of working, you have to actualize the labor power. You have to actualize the
So
potential.
you see the Marxist in you here.
Well, it's a useful language,
resurface.
So like, but it's like,
course.
yeah. So it's like, so I think fundamentally what management is about is ensuring that your work has an output, and that when you're paid wages, that something is coming from that. And so, fundamentally, I think that's kind of what like the point of management is. I mean, I trace like a bit of a history of that sort of underlies algorithmic management specifically in this, because I take your point about the internet and stuff, but it's important for me to locate the origins of algorithmic management, if we want to like put it like that, not kind of with like the computer revolution of the 70s, but more like the sort of like bureaucratic revolution within work in like the 1910s and 1920s. So I start off with Taylor, because I do kind of think that Frederick Winslow Taylor, because I do kind of think that we're in a fundamentally Taylorist paradigm here. And Taylor's big insight, he's often associated with piecework and stuff like that, and wages for piecework, sort of breaking down the labor process in this way. But his real insight was to do with power and communication. His observation, and this was a man who really hated organized agitators, as he called them, but his real observation was that owners of factories would kind of hire workers in to do a job, and the workers, it's not that they would kind of like go slow or sabotage or anything like that, but they wouldn't work to their full potential because they knew they didn't have to, because fundamentally they knew more about the work process than the manager did. The manager was there to pay them, and then to kind of get the product kind of thing, and not to really interfere with the actual happening of work. And so his idea was to separate the conception and execution of work. That was like the fundamental, I would say that's the fundamental kind of like development. And that becomes central to so much of management thinking subsequently throughout the 20th century. And it happens in different ways, and through the book I kind of talk about like humanistic forms that this takes, and trying to harness like the social aspects of the workplace, and also sort of talk about like Japanese management thinking where these ideas in some sense are kind of coming together. But I think that the sort of like there's like a sort of cybernetic turn that happens like in the 20th century, where feedback loops can be kind of built into the work process itself, and also then with computerization subsequently, management no longer kind of productivity thinking no longer kind of has to necessarily detour through representation, and can instead sort of focus on these sort of like systems of kind of like sped up or automatic kind of calculation. And where I try and get to it is that I think one of the things that's novel about algorithmic management is that, and we should probably say what it is, but it's basically it's a system where workers can be instructed, tracked, monitored, guided, assessed, allocated within their work by an algorithmic system, without necessarily having human managerial input.
Can
into
you
that. And it'll happen on a real-time basis. That's
like
the important
some examples? Like I think one classic example is the bracelet of Amazon workers that calculates the time they spend in the toilet. It has become almost common sense, at least in my bubble, that I don't know how representative it is, but what are can you tell us some like telling examples of how the algorithm works as a manager?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the first examples I give in the book is a worker called Lorenzo. Lorenzo works at a logistics hub that sort of services a major airport, services Heathrow, that kind of like Heathrow, like industrial corridor. And he's kind of like in the back-end hub that is going to organize produce for going out to supermarkets and stores all across London. And he starts his work day by entering the workplace, and he gets given a handheld scanner, and he scans it, and it's then assigned to him for the day. And then the scanner, there's an interface on the scanner, and it's actually like he calls it a wristwatch, but it's basically like a big thing like strapped to his forearm. It weighs about 450 grams, so it's quite heavy. It's like a small tablet almost, but with buttons on his forearm, and then it has a wire that goes down to his finger where there's a ring scanner, so it's like it clips onto the end of his finger.
It's a Motorola device, right?
It's the Motorola WT4000.
It's somehow a bit
scanner,
iconic. I did some Googling, and it seems to have its
iconic.
own.
Yeah, actually, I should say after my research, but it became iconic because Banksy put it in the Dismaland exhibition. But there are others, the Motorola MC3000, if you were to really go down it. I mean, really, we should have hired one or something for the stream and played around with it. But so like he gets one of these, and it tells him where to go, what to do, like what to pick. It doesn't actually tell him his productivity. In some places like Amazon, it'll tell you your productivity. It might give you a countdown timer. So it might give you 12 seconds to pick the next item and locate and pick the next item. And so you're kind of working in these sort of like micro loops of productivity. But in his case, it tells him where to go and what to do, but it tracks him as well. If he goes to the bathroom, that's time off task, and so it brings his productivity down. At the end of the day, he kind of hangs up his scanner and he leaves. But then in the morning, the next day, he wakes up to a text message that's automated from the productivity system that tells him whether his shift for that day is confirmed or cancelled based on his performance the previous day. And confirmed or cancelled is, whether he's above or below. I think it's 92%. 92% of what he doesn't know, but he's either above or below 92% of the desired performance. And his shift can be punitively cancelled at a moment's notice because he's an agency worker on a 0 hours contract. Now, interestingly, he doesn't have to be on a 0 hours contract, but because he's an agency worker, and that's very normal in that sector, the union branch at that workplace doesn't want to know him, essentially, because agency workers, because they're temporary, don't count towards the calculation for recognition agreements. And so fundamentally, he doesn't have any actual representation in his work either.
You've already touched on something else I wanted to ask in this response, which is about your methods.
Okay.
So I think we have a good idea of the topics and the issues and questions that you're interested in the book and research project. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit like how you went about researching this. You mentioned Lorenzo, there's some field work, but I think that I just invite you as well, as you're talking through that, to reflect on if you're researching this kind of these conditions, what are the methodological challenges? Why did you do it the way that you did, and what are the maybe bigger political questions as well that are raised around methodology in this for this kind of research?
So before you answer this articulated question, I have an easier one. Sorry, I'm like the woman, the lay woman today. Michael is admittedly more prepared than me. I'm also concerned that maybe these jeans are too short. But anyhow, so what you told about Lorenzo and the algorithm is quite brutal. It's quite violent, right? Because you have like an object judging you, and you don't know what kind of criteria this object work with, or this subject work with. So at least when other humans are involved, you can say, okay, I have to be at least as good as Chris, or at least as good as Cecilia. Okay, I can live with that. But you are 92% of what? And how would Lorenzo or other participants in your study react to it? Were they angry at the algorithm? Were they subdued? What is how do you react? What kind of affective relationship you have with the Cyberboss?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I stole your question, but then
That's
we
all
talk
right.
about methods.
I try and open.
But
them
I was
both.
very curious.
Yeah. I try and get into them both. I mean, one of the big methodological problems, like a really obvious one, is just access to these workplaces. Not least, if you want to access them through, literally, through the companies, it's probably not going to happen unless there's something really in it for them. And accessing the workers is hard because a lot of the jobs are very high turnover, or people feel kind of at risk, and so on. I would say that there's also methodological challenges if you really kind of wanted to get into okay, but what is the data? How is it calculated? What how do we think about these types of data? Because the data isn't just the productivity of scanning. Increasingly, it's the monitoring of movement, for example, or in some workplaces even experiments with kind of affective algorithmic management and so on. But I mean, I kind of contend that because there is, I think, a bit of a movement around explainability and opening black boxes and things like that, and I kind of maintain that I don't really think that you could hope to isolate any particular algorithmic function or line of code that would yield the explanatory power to explain the new politics of the workplace. And so I'm kind of okay with speaking to the workers and getting a sense of what they understand by the algorithm, how they interact with it day to day, which is also not what you would get from a patent or something, even though those things can be patents for these sorts of actual wearables can be instructive because they can sort of teach you about some of the affordances or the desires behind that underlie them, for example. And I did a bit of that as well. But what was the second question?
How Lorenzo feels.
Oh yeah. So
I want to know about Lorenzo.
Yeah. I really wanted to get into the subjective experience of working with these things, or what Mark Fisher calls the political phenomenology. So I wanted to get the political phenomenology of the workplace. And I found that algorithmic management, has a number of effects. I mean, obviously effects on things like labor allocation, as I just mentioned, but In some workplaces, it has an effect on people's conception of time. So, if you have 12 seconds to pick something, and that just sort of repeats, and that is your day, is 12 seconds, 12 seconds, 12 seconds. It's almost like a state of flow, but a flow that is harnessed like for the kind of productivity machine, and for kind of like the ends of the employer fundamentally. So yeah, disrupting people's sense of time, disrupting people's sense of space, particularly in a warehouse context. People are working within very high stacks. If you imagine like, the biggest library that you've been in, very high stacks. So you can only see like in two directions at any given time. And the organization of workers by the algorithm should be such that workers are not actually kind of encountering each other. They're not being, it's like Pac-Man, right? Like they're not like going down, you shouldn't be going down your aisle and someone's coming back the other way, because the aisles are narrow and that's going to create congestion. So instead you're being sent in the same direction, or you're far away from each other. You're picking items that are kind of continually near. I know that like in the BBC and stuff, people have talked about like, having to run for items and stuff, but really, people should be moving relatively little to get to like the next item. And to facilitate this, Amazon has a random stow system where, CDs, like, a shelf will have a CD and a toilet brush and a Christmas tree, like all on one shelf, because it's much easier to pick out a CD from, a shelf of a Christmas tree and a toilet brush and a sofa, not a sofa, but a sofa cushion, than it is to pick out a CD from a shelf of CDs. They don't want workers doing that, so they stow the items randomly to facilitate this. And so within that, then, people would say, I'm aware that I'm in like a very, big workplace with 200 people working at any given time, but I don't actually see anybody. I might see a worker, somewhere in the distance, kind of cut across the aisle somewhere, but I'm not actually interacting with anyone. And so you also, this is not just in Amazon, but many other places, there's a real reduction in kind of like the sociality as a workplace, and an emphasis on redirecting kind of communication that we might expect to have happen between people, but redirecting it through the device instead. Now, obviously, things like being like told like not to talk and stuff at work is not novel or like new to Amazon. But I think it was striking that it came up like time and again. People said that they never had a job where they talk less. And it's worth saying that all of these things, the ability to be in physical space with your co-workers, the ability to have some degree of time to have a conversation, and the ability to actually converse, are all prerequisites for organizing politically. Okay? Like anyone who's ever done any kind of like organizer training 101, the first thing, speak to your colleagues, find out where your colleagues are in your workplace. Like all of these things, like, they're actually like borderline impossible within the workplace in these places.
I want to ask about something else that I found interesting. I think it's part of a broader conversation as well about the impact of the algorithms have on organizations. But algorithms also change management, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the discussions I think that's really interesting in your book. So can you talk a little bit about like what happens to management with this kind of the rise of the algorithm?
Yeah. So like you see this. I describe it as like a reorganization of authority, I think, within the workplace, where the algorithm itself, or the idea of the algorithm, or sometimes just the system, is elevated and sort of bestowed with its own power, both kind of like perceived and in a sense kind of like a real power, like a kind of like a protocological power, like it's constantly like updating and demanding, the sort of its nature like demands that, people have to sort of work to it in certain ways and with it in certain ways. But, this is kind of interesting because it complicates this, maybe traditional sense that we might have where workers are kind of taking instruction from managers or from supervisors. And I say in the book that like, supervisors in particular, it's interesting what happens to them because the traditional like epistemological sort of function of supervisors of like having this oversight and kind of like knowing more than other people is completely hollowed out. And were it not for the fact that they do kind of, they mainly still reserve some basic disciplinary functions, they get to shout at people or whatever, and that's, fine. They have a sort of like a monopoly on, like, what's the Hannah Arendt thing, monopoly on state violence. They have like a monopoly on, like, shouting at people in the workplace and being
Disciplinary power.
disciplinary power, but like, were it not for that, they might be described as kind of like subvisors, because they are observing and sort of seeing, like, the workings of the algorithm almost from the same point of view as workers, and their role kind of changes to be almost like like a kind of like a pastoral kind of role, to like help people to work with the algorithm better, rather than
like
to
coaches in a way.
yeah, rather than to like discipline them based on the algorithm always. Like, in one workplace I spoke to, it was Amazon warehouse. The person I spoke to was a packer, and he kind of said, like, look, does anybody hit the target? He spoke to all of the co-workers that he could around him. He was in a rare position in that he's like stationary every day, and so he can sort of shout across to the next person, does anybody hit this target? Because I'm not hitting the target, and nobody hits the target. So he came to the conclusion, well, the target that we have for our work must not be the target that, like, Amazon has for its actual fulfillment of orders, because Amazon does fulfill its orders. Like, we've experienced it. Like, it's very effective at, like, as a logistical process. But, like, this is just they're just giving us this target to discipline us. So he spoke to the supervisor and said, look, this target business, like, where do I stand with it? And he said, well, the supervisor just gives me some tips for how best to pack a box, or how best to kind of, optimize myself towards the algorithm. And that this is sort of fundamentally, like, what his main interactions with the supervisors are, is like sort of like the giving of tips and so on. But I also think that it reorganizes management in ways that are more kind of like politically interesting still, which is that I talk about, like, managerial distanciation in the book. And so the sort of algorithmic system and the use of devices and interfaces both allows the possibility of a physical distance from the shop floor for managers, and that they can not be present because the workers are kind of being supervised by the interface. That's their first kind of line of management, and so there are a few of them actually kind of like present, but also kind of like in terms of like the labor process, they're less involved with like the actual giving out of instructions. And so this does a couple of things. It means that actually managers don't always know like what is happening, or like what is being allocated where. It's being decided by the system, but it also gives them a kind of plausible deniability, in that if something is kind of going wrong, it's not the manager to blame, it's like the system. And actually the system knows best, because it's an authority on itself. And so this mantra came up in a lot of different workplaces of just trust the system.
Yeah. I want to know if there's some questions from the audience, whether online, offline, half and half. Of course, you've been talking about, it's a slightly depressing picture. Like, I'm sure there is also the part on tactics of resistance. I'm sort of a Foucauldian, so wherever there's power, there must be also some patterns of resistance. And I know that in the book you talk about it. So if you want to know how to resist the algorithm, buy the book and read the book. But yes, it's something that it's when we talk about work, we really talk about the well-being of people, the relationship with power, the relationship of solidarity with colleagues, the opportunity, the kind of social and personal relationship that one establishes, as well as how control is exercised. And I think that this idea of the system is quite interesting, because it's very like this disembodied power. I mean, the power has always been kind of systemic, right? I mean, it has never been at least in modern times, fully embodied in one individual. But I think this is even more evident now, and of course it poses the question of how to resist this kind of power. And it's interesting how it is, in a way, de-responsabilizing for individuals, so that supervisor or human managers become almost like your pulse. Like, okay, I coach you into coping with the algorithm. So that was me filling the time so that people can gather their ideas. Do we have some questions online? Aspetta, non mi alzerò mai più. It's very difficult for me. You were right. Like, I cannot
Try to do.
Come
I
in,
mean,
come in.
I'm now in the screen. No, I'm not in the streaming anyway. So Matthias from home. I just need to go here anyway. Okay, still in the front of the scene. Hi.
Hi,
So
welcome.
Matthias from home is asking if beyond this expansion of algorithm in management from logistic to society, such as the social factory, are there inverse movements too? And I ask if this was about movement of resistance, because this is the way I intended, but actually I think I misunderstood, because the second part of the question, as you can see here, is thinking about platforms that copy features of leisure or non-work platforms to analyze and monitor productivity of weird variables within work environments.
I mean,
Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
why.
I mean, this is a super interesting question, and not one that I like tackle like head on, but like there is a relationship. I would point you to work of someone like Phoebe Moore, where there's a relationship between like kind of like the use of this like management of the self technologies, like Fitbits and like the quantified self and like health tracking apps, sleep tracking apps, and this kind of relationship between that whole industry of like health tracking, or and some people see it as like social tracking, Strava for your runs and things like that, and work technologies. Like that's a kind of like a real kind of like bleed that's kind of happening. I don't know if it's relevant to the question or not, but it is also the case that particularly with some kind of like app-driven algorithmic management, there are kind of like ostensibly kind of like non-work functions sometimes built into them, so like playful functions or like gamified functions that are kind of there to encourage some kind of like social investment, whether it's like leaderboards or being able to like compare statistics and things like that with your coworkers. I spoke to some people who worked for a food delivery platform, and once they decided they were going to finish, they would actually cycle out of their way to go and meet with other riders to compare their stats as like a sort of fun thing to do, and like kind of like compete with each other, in this kind of slightly sort of like machismo kind of way, but like sort of like see who could like outperform each other, which is very much kind of like people kind of comparing their personal bests with Strava or with CrossFit or something like that, but they were comparing their kind of personal bests with Deliveroo.
I'll just pass the microphone. Question from the audience.
We should say, by the way, so we've had playing in the background this game, because I just saw Insurrection flash up behind us. But to build a better mousetrap is this kind of like sort of abstract like management game that kind of has a lot to do with algorithm management. We should say props to Timothy, who is like
If I keep looking off screen as well,
playing in the background. Yeah.
This is where we can see the game.
It was just a follow-up thing. It didn't deserve, I think, even the microphone. But given that you were talking about that races, to compare, the end of the day type of results, rather than more than the Fitbit thing, it reminds me more of that Burawoy research that they did around the piecework and how that was concealing somehow the control, no? It's so interiorized somehow, that level of control that, they want to show off how well they did. that's the job done. You don't even need the
Yeah.
apps anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Well, you do them to just continue that game-like type
Yeah.
of ambient and environment. But yeah, and my question has always been, I wonder, how actually skilled the designers of those, devices and control mechanism, digital algorithm were in, thinking back to piecework and thinking back to the game attraction, the game element of it, which
Yeah,
I
I
find
mean-
quite, scary.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. There's a bit in the book where I kind of take some inspiration from Natasha Dow-Schul, who researched on like the design of casinos and like slot machines and things like that, and this kind of like sort of addiction by design is the name of the book, but how these this almost kind of like sort of like psychological hacking kind of like happens to get the job done, as you say. And to go back to the earlier question of like management, like these technologies are really about achieving like a certainty of result. Like that's the idea, is that workers can be many things. They can be really productive, they can also be lazy, they can have good days and bad days, they can chat to each other, they can have fun, they can be serious, they can be like too depressed to work, they can be all sorts of things. And like so much of these technologies, what they're trying to conceal all that and trying to just get a kind of like a sort of like a uniform kind of like output that is like measurable and trackable, and doesn't have to look the same every day, but as long as you can kind of like track it and model it and predict it, then that is the job done.
I think there's so many other things that we could talk about with your reading of algorithmic management. I think there's also interesting observations about how it, in a way, reorganizes ignorance as well, and how it really privileges performance. But I think to move things more towards a conclusion and to pick up the question that Carolina asked about tactics, I think we can go a little bit over time, given that we started late. But to wrap things up, let's talk a little bit about where you see the potential for political intervention in this whole situation. When I read it, I was really quite struck by, in your book, your knowledge and reflections on the role of unions when it comes to interventions in this area, and also your historical accounts of why unions have maybe struggled to think about technology, or to really like to consider that within their modes of intervention. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, and then, because I think that this is how I read the book. This is part of your intervention, is to sort of look at that broad landscape and the things that you're emphasizing, like this lived experience on the work floor, the importance of technology, the effects it has, thinking of technology also as a system that's reorganizing labor and so on. I see it as a kind of like you're making a contribution, right, to this, like, what are the possibilities here? I'm making a bit of a statement now rather than a question, but can you sort of expand a little bit on how you see the role of unions when it comes to this situation, how you see the kind of contribution you're wanting to make in this book for how people that are involved in labor politics might think differently about what's going on here?
Yeah, so like I remember actually having this kind of like minor tussle with my editor, John Merrick, who I'm grateful for. He gave so much to the book, so if you're watching, John, I appreciate you. But he won't mind me saying that we had like a small back and forth about, I said that basically in the society where we have to work in order to live, unions are basically a good thing. And he crossed out basically and said they're a good thing. And I said, no, I mean to be slightly equivocal there, because like anyone who's ever like spent time in like trade union politics like knows how like imperfect that can be, and like even in like good unions there can be like good and bad ideas and good and bad strategies and people who are a fucking nightmare. Like, you know, like it just like happens. And like, you know, there are also like good and bad unions as well. Like, I mean, you know, I will happily say that I think USDOR are a bad union. USDOR is the union that represents, you know, mainly shop workers in this country, and they certainly in the supermarket sector are one of the biggest unions there. And you know, we just had like a massive pandemic where public opinion of like supermarket workers and public sympathy for supermarket workers was never higher, and like people like really felt that they were essential workers, almost on a par with like nurses and doctors. And you know, their members were like coming down with COVID, like left, right, and center, taking it to their families and all sorts, and they managed to win nothing. They won nothing throughout that whole time. Like, it was like the perfect opportunity to like win anything, and they didn't win anything. And I think that's like bewildering. I mean, it's interesting that like when I have this kind of this conversation about the book, like within, you know, particularly among people around like thinking about kind of tech and digital mediation and stuff, like it's always surprising to me, like, you know, people will talk about like informational capitalism and stuff like that, but actually unions don't figure much at all in the conversation. Like actual unions don't really figure as like the actual like political vehicles that we might think of for making change happen. When you speak to people who think about like management and kind of the organization of work, unions kind of come up a lot more, but I think there's a reluctance to kind of be critical often, because people who think about unions are acutely aware that they have been like under attack for 40 years or more, and like I make no concession to that whatsoever. But like, as someone who has like been in this world and like organized both within and without of unions, and you know, kind of has this kind of, you know, 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of like politics, kind of like an autonomous kind of like politics around labor, like you know, I do think there is like room for improvement, and I am sympathetic to the idea that, well, we kind of have to like organize in unions because it's what we have. Like, they are something that we have. Like, I think it's important to say that, and I'm not like misty-eyed about them or like, you know, nostalgic particularly. I know said the stuff about like the miners' strike and that, but like I'm more interested in like the future. But like trade unions are really bad when it comes to technology. They're really bad. They don't want to be seen as anti-technology by any stretch. That's like because they think it just consigns them to the historical dustbin. So they're really reluctant to just be like anti-technology. They often buy into this narrative, which is a management narrative of like, we can like share the benefit of the technology. I actually got like I'm doing a paper at the European Trade Union Institute next year. I just found out. And it's called "Stop Trying to Make Sharing the Benefit Happen," and why getting real with technology means getting real with management. So that will go down like a sick sandwich. So we'll see. But I just feel like it needs to be said. Like someone needs to say it. Like someone who's on side like needs to say it. And so like in the book, you know, to go back to the resistance question, I completely agree with you, Carolina. That like where there's power, there's resistance. And in actual fact, I think that algorithmic management comes about because of the power of workers and kind of in response to them. And I identify ways that workers, quite of their own accord, are resisting these technologies through things like slowdowns or through intentional mistakes, or what one participant called fuckery, or snooping or skiving. And finding ways that they can do this in such a way that's often like undetected and actually kind of like invokes some of the strategies that someone like James C. Scott talks about in relation to kind of like, you know, sort of nascent anti-colonial struggles. And so, you know, because it's like a high-risk environment and the consequences are severe, and so how do you organize in that context? And I think some people have read it as kind of like a fetishization of like micro-resistance, which I don't think is fair, but I do think there's a case for like broadening the kind of like activist or organizing repertoire. And I think it probably needs to both be prepared to take on questions of technology and management, and probably, you know, stop recognizing the right to manage, which kind of like gets put into every recognition agreement like boilerplate, as if it's like a natural law that like the employer has the right to manage, and it's like that's a massive concession. And I don't think you can, you can't. I think a lot of unions who do want to do good work on technology increasingly, because they are changing on it, and I should recognize that, but like they will still try and hang their concerns on kind of like health and safety or like data rights and these kind of like quite sort of like narrow ledges, rather than just kind of like actually like tackling the problem of like, look, this is injurious to workers, like it's making work undignified, like, this is what like actual workers are like saying about these technologies. We should do something about it. It demands a political response, and that's kind of not currently forthcoming.
I think this is a good actually point to wrap up on. There's so many other things that I would have loved to have talked to you about and with you about, and I'm sure that we'll have that occasion, just not on
CDI
stream.
TV ever wants to do a Cyberboss series in the future.
Yeah,
Summer of Cyberboss.
I think
I'm here for it.
the things that of what you're talking about remind me of the history of participatory design in Scandinavia. I think is a good point to go with what you're saying about like how do we think about the design of technology from the ground up with workers as co-participants, really not subject to management in advance. And I would love an opportunity to push you a bit further too on like where these micro political practices go when you scale them up, and what also barriers do they hit. But I think we're going to leave it there.
I mean, I do explain that in the book, so people can.
Yeah, that's a good.
We don't
it's a good
want to
s-
spoil
good-
everything, right?
No, exactly.
We
People
spoiled
can
quite a
read the
bit,
book,
yeah. But
or can absorb the book.
oh,
To
but
absorb the book,
you-
you have to choose a page, say 180, and then just do like that.
well, I
And
think
let it think,
another way into the book is to read the
without
epilogue,
cross leg, like this.
the 3-page epilogue on AI.
Yeah.
I think is a good starting point for the book.
Interesting.
Okay.
See, it's circular. It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good intervention there as well, that hopefully in another stream we get a chance to get into the challenges around AI and creative labor. But thank you, Craig, for talking about your book.
Thank you for having me.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading it.
I'm really
I
pleased.
didn't get an opportunity to just say, it's wonderfully written.
Thank you.
So I say it now. Yeah, and I love the different styles, and there's some deep theoretical engagement. There's some nice narratives around your I guess you would call them the people that you're speaking with, your co-investigators
Yeah.
in the workers' inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
There's some great stories there about their experiences as well. So, yep, check out the book. Get a copy of it one way or another.
We should have said all these flattering things to you before starting, right? This is another lesson that I'll take home for the next stream.
I like that you kept it till the end. It meant that I didn't know where
The
I
final,
didn't totally know where I stood all the way through, and it probably made me better for it.
Yeah, the bit of
It
substance.
meant I couldn't get complacent,
This is a very nice book, very nice cover also. So if you don't want to read it, you can kind of display it and it still work. Not jokes apart. Cyberboss, Craig, thank you very much for being here, and stay tuned with the CDI TV because we have more episodes to come. And thank you very much. Now I'm going to collapse somewhere. So maybe I can just collapse here. Bye. Bye. Woo! Thank you. Are we offline?